Now, you might have worries about Locke's hedonism because his hedonism claims that all and only pleasure is good. And then Locke gives all these examples of how, well, kind of different things are going to be good to different people because different things are pleasant to different people. And so different people's happiness consists in different things. And some of the examples of this idea that he gives are fairly innocuous. You know, some people like hawking, sending a hawk out to go kill little animals or whatever. And other people like, the suburban life, but that's not Locke's example, but one of his example, one of his examples might raise an eyebrow. He says something about debauchery, right? And we talked about that last time. Take an even more extreme case. Take someone who enjoys hurting people, against their will, right? That's what gives them pleasure, right? They're, I don't know what you'd call a person like that, kind of psychopathic in a certain sense. They can't empathize with other people, with the pain that they feel. And for whatever reason, they find pleasure in hurting people. Is Locke saying that that's good? That person should go and, hurt other people? No, he's not saying that person should go and hurt other people. He would say, however, that person's happiness consists in hurting people. That's what's pleasant to them. That's what their happiness consists in, Locke would say. The key here, however, and so, isn't this crazy? How could Locke say something like that? Well, Locke would say, slow down. I don't think you should go after happiness at all costs. Happiness isn't the end of the line. It's not the end game. It's not the most important thing, Locke would say. In fact, there are certain values that are far more important and overriding of happiness. And in particular, what Locke would say is morality, right? This kind of psychopathic person who wants to hurt other people, sure, fine, their happiness consists in hurting other people, but it's immoral to hurt other people. And so they shouldn't do it, right? And so, maybe they're consigned to a life of less happiness than they otherwise could have, but that's because they have these immoral desires. And when your happiness conflicts with the commands of morality, you got to go with morality, Locke would say. And so that brings us to this notion of morality. And Locke addresses it by thinking about, by putting it in terms of moral good and moral evil. That's how he approaches the issue of morality: moral good and moral evil. Now, the first thing he notes is that in order for our actions to be moral, or immoral for that matter, in order for it to make sense to call, for our actions to have, put it this way, in order for our actions to have any kind of moral value assigned to them, morally praiseworthy, morally blameworthy, morally good, morally bad, whatever, in order for our actions to at all be moral, there has to be some law that they either conform to or are in violation of. Right? Morality implies a law. That's his idea. And so in order for your action to be moral, your action has to conform to that law. And in order for your action to be immoral, it must be that your action is violating that law. And so you can see him kind of picking up on an idea that we saw in Aquinas. This idea in Aquinas, the way he puts it, is that you can't have an obligation unless there's a law. And Aquinas picks up on the etymology of the word obligation, how it's derived from the word for law. Locke, it's a little bit different here. There isn't such a tight connection, but Locke seems to have the idea is the same. It doesn't make sense to talk about actions being moral or immoral unless there's some kind of standard of morality, that standard being some sort of law, right? There has to be a moral law. And so since we do talk about moral good and moral evil, right, there's got to be some sort of thing such as a moral law. And what Locke notes about law then is that in its essence, what it is it's some rule, the breaking of which will be punished. That's the essence of law. So we get Locke following Aquinas to a degree, right? He thinks that the idea of morality or moral obligation or something like that requires that there be some sort of law. That's a kind of Thomistic point, or a point that Thomas makes at least. But when it comes to the essence of law, to what law is, Locke's got a very different understanding, right? For Aquinas, the essence of law, it had this kind of fourfold essence, if you will, right? Any law had to be a command of reason, ordered toward the good, made by a proper authority, and promulgated. When Locke discusses the essence of law, and he doesn't have as explicit a discussion as Aquinas does. This is something he mentions more tangentially. But when Locke discusses the essence of law, order of reason gone, order toward the good gone, even promulgated is gone. Really, all that seems to matter is that it be made by the proper authority and that there be a punishment attached to it, right? That's the real nature of a law. It's a rule that you'll be punished for breaking. You have a rule like that, you've got a law, right? And so there has to be something like that for morality. Now, a bit of terminology. In Locke's writing, so we're reading from two different works that he wrote, he doesn't really use the phrase the moral law at all. He doesn't use that phrase, but that's essentially what he's talking about when he talks about the divine law. So in the essay concerning human understanding, he uses that phrase, the divine law. That's the moral law, according to Locke, right? The divine law, the moral law. And he calls it the divine law because in his view, God gives it to us. God gives us this law. Right? The moral law comes from God. And so again, in a certain sense, he seems to be similar to Aquinas. Aquinas thought the natural law came from God. The natural law was the eternal law, which is God's plan for everything, but the eternal law as it applies to us in particular. Locke doesn't have that in the background. He thinks of the divine law as God giving us commands, right? God just gives us commands. Those commands are the moral law. Yeah. In the second treatise of government, he doesn't talk about the moral law. He never really talks about that. That's just not his preferred phrase. But in the second treatise of government, he doesn't use the phrase the divine law either. Instead, he uses the law of nature. And we're going to talk about the law of nature more in the second treatise in a subsequent video. But we find that terminology. That can be kind of confusing. Are these the same thing? If you recall Aquinas wants to make a very sharp distinction between these different kinds of law. The divine law, that's like revealed law. That's Moses bringing the 10 Commandments, according to Aquinas. And then the natural law is this other thing. It's this thing written in your heart. And there might be overlap between them, sure, fine, but they're different, right? For Locke, they are not different. It can be confusing, but they are not different. They are not different. These things are all the same. The moral law is the divine law, which just is the law of nature. Locke just uses different phrases to refer to the exact same thing, whereas Aquinas doesn't do that. Aquinas distinguishes these different laws, and he thinks that they're different, right? But in Locke, they're the same. The divine law simply is the law of nature. It's just another word for it, another name for it, right? They're synonyms. Okay. So we've got to have some sort of moral law. It's this divine law, this law of nature, whatever he wants to call it. Well, what is moral good and moral evil then? Well, Locke's going to use his hedonism here, right? According to his hedonism, all and only pleasure is good. And so when we talk about the moral good, we must be talking about some sort of pleasure, right? And likewise, when we talk about moral evil, if pleasure is all and only pleasure is good, all and only pain is evil. And so when we talk about moral evil, what we're ultimately referring to is something like the pain that you get from breaking the divine law, right? So moral good is the pleasure you receive, the pleasure you experience from following the divine law. Moral evil is the pain you experience from breaking it. Now, and then he'll say, yeah, moral good, the pleasure, that's like your reward for following the law. And the pain for breaking it, right? The moral law, your pain, the pain, that's like the punishment for breaking the law, right? Okay, and so we have a true law. It's, you're rewarded and you're punished for breaking or following it, whatever, which one you do. And so that makes it look like, as far as that goes, well, Aquinas, I guess, or Locke, I should say, Locke is saying that, yeah, you go and you do the right thing. You help somebody out who's in need. That's like following you do unto others as you would have them do to you. Okay, fine. So you go and you're kind to people, say. Well, moral good, the moral good is supposed to be the pleasure you receive for following divine law. So I guess, you might think the idea there is that, virtue is its own reward, that doing the right thing is its own reward, that following the moral law will be pleasant in itself. Might be what you think. And you might think that, well, look, if you break the law, you're going to feel all bad about it, feel all guilty, and that pain is your punishment. That might be what you think on the basis of what we see here. That is not what Locke thinks. He claims that moral rectitude, that is to say, following the moral law, following the divine law, is not in itself good. It's not in itself pleasant. Not necessarily, at least. Maybe you derive pleasure from doing that, but certainly not always and not everybody. Moral rectitude is not in itself pleasant. And so what he's picking up on here is that, doing the right thing, that might be kind of a drag. That might be kind of a bummer. You don't really want to do it. And it's, and it's kind of bad for you, and it hurts, and it's not as much fun and whatever, right? Moral rectitude is not in itself good. It's not in itself pleasant. And moral depravity, moreover, is not in itself evil or painful. Yeah, maybe you kind of feel bad when you do something wrong, but maybe you don't. And in fact, the worst people among us, they don't feel bad when they do something wrong, when they're morally depraved, when they violate the moral law. That's why they're the worst people among us, right? It's precisely because they don't feel any guilt over the terrible things that they do. And so moral depravity is not in itself evil or painful. So doing the right thing is not good in itself. Doing the wrong thing is not evil in itself, is what Aquinas is saying. Well, then what is moral good and moral evil? Locke. Do I keep saying Aquinas? Locke. Locke's idea is that, the lawgiver, the person who made the law, gave us these commands, who gave us the divine law, that is to say, God, affixes a reward to following his law, and he affixes a punishment for violating it. And you don't receive that reward right away, not necessarily, and you don't receive that punishment right away. And so Locke would say, yeah, you might go and, rob your liquor store or whatever, your local liquor store. And that's evil. Don't do that, right? That's breaking God's law. God set down this divine law saying thou shalt not steal or don't steal or whatever, yeah. And then you go do it. You might just go home with a backpack full of liquor and you have yourself a grand old evening, right? And you might feel great. And, I don't know. What are the tricks for hangovers? Pedialyte? And that's what I don't know. One of my friends swore on that. You drink Pedialyte in the morning, you feel great, right? You don't feel any pain at all. Yeah, you had a heck of a night with all that stolen liquor, and then you feel great in the morning. You do it again tomorrow, right? And it might be the same thing over and over, right? You might not. So you might go through life, and it's just grand and great. It doesn't look like there's any punishment there. God affixes a punishment to it. It's not your potential hangover or anything like that. It's not getting caught. You might not get caught. You might not have a hangover. The punishment he affixes to it, as you might imagine, is hell. And the reward, right? You do the right thing. Maybe nobody cares. Maybe people spit on you for doing the right thing. Maybe, right? And life just keeps being miserable. Well, at the end of your life, you will be rewarded for following the divine law, according to Locke. That's Locke's view. And so the reward is heaven, and the punishment is hell. And so moral good, what is that? It's the pleasure you experience in heaven. It's heaven, basically. Moral good is the pleasure of heaven, and moral evil is the pain of hell, right? And so God sets down this law: don't steal, don't murder, etc., and so forth. And he affixes rewards and punishments to it. If you break it, you go to hell. If you keep it, you go to heaven. And heaven, very pleasant. Hell, very painful, right? That's Locke's idea. One little wrinkle to add to this. If you recall, when we were going over Locke's hedonism, Locke says something like the following: what's good? Pleasure, or that which causes pleasure. And the same thing with evil. It's pain, or that which causes or tends to increase pain. And so it's kind of like, by extension, right? The things that cause pleasure, we can call those things good too. Well, the same thing's going to apply here. And so, helping out those in need, loving your neighbor, say, that's what the divine law commands. If you follow it, right, you'll go to heaven. That's kind of Locke's idea here, right? And so you'll receive moral good. Well, by extension, we can say that the actions that tend to cause you to go to heaven, that those actions themselves are morally good, right? Because they tend to lead toward the moral good itself. They tend to lead you to heaven, right? You'll go to heaven if you do things like that. So we can say, Locke would say, we can say that helping out people in need, loving your neighbor, those things are morally good. Why? Well, because they lead to heaven, which is the moral good, the pleasure of heaven, right? These things tend to cause you to experience the pleasure of heaven. And so those things, those actions are morally good. Same thing with morally evil, right? Moral evil, strictly speaking, is the pain you feel in hell. But by extension, we can call the actions that would get you sent to hell morally evil, right? So murdering people or knocking off your local liquor store there or whatever, right? We can say those things are morally evil. Those actions are morally evil because they tend to get you into hell. They tend to lead to your punishment, to that pain of hell, right? Okay, so that's moral good and evil. That's Aquinas's understanding of the moral law, moral good, moral evil, and so forth, right? And this is how he kind of blends his hedonism into it. Now, two kinds of worries. We'll deal with one in this video and then one in the next video, in the next lecture. So the second worry that we're going to have, that we're going to try to confront, it concerns the Euthyphro dilemma. So that'll be the next, right? You might wonder how, given this view of things, Locke is going to respond to something like the Euthyphro dilemma. We'll look at that later. The worry to look at right now is, well, I don't know about this view of things. This makes morality out to look like a very self-centered, self-interested business. And it does that by doing something like the following. It makes it look like morality is really, in acting morally, is really just something you should do in order to secure more pleasure for yourself. It looks very egoistic. It makes morality look very egoistic. You should, why, so you imagine someone saying to themselves, well, why should I follow this divine law? I don't know. I'd really like to go on a bender this weekend. That guy at the liquor store is a jerk. He never, he always cards and never sells to us. We're underage or whatever, right? Why should I obey the divine law and not steal? What the picture Locke has painted would suggest is that, well, look, you shouldn't steal, because if you steal, you're going to be punished with hell. And hell is super painful. And you don't want that, right? And so, yeah, it'd be a lot of fun to have a whole bunch of liquor and just get blitzed over the weekend and whatever. That'd be great. But hell is like way, way worse. I mean, the pain of hell outweighs the fun we'd have from all that liquor, right? And so don't go steal all that liquor. Instead, just, no, don't steal, don't be a jerk to people, don't murder people, whatever, right? So that you really get the good stuff in heaven. You really have a lot of fun, a lot of pleasure in heaven, right? So you should go be helpful to people and kind to people so you can have the most pleasure for yourself possible. That looks gross, kind of. That's not how morality is supposed to work. That's not your paradigmatic moral agent. The person who's motivated like that doesn't look particularly moral at all. They look like a jerk, a self-centered, self-interested jerk. Is that Locke's picture? No, it's not. People raised this worry to Locke in his own lifetime, and so he attempted to respond to it. He wanted to say, no, that's not why you should obey the divine law. He says, right, so all this stuff about moral good and moral evil and so on, this is all true, but Locke was emphatic. You shouldn't obey the divine law just because you'll get pleasure from doing it. It's not this self-interested thing. And so then that raises the question, okay, fine, Locke, good. I'm glad you agree with that, because that guy, the self-interested dude, looks kind of crazy. So then why should you obey the divine law then, Locke? Why obey the divine law? What reason is there for that? Here's what Locke says, right? So let's take a fella who's pondering that question, and he has a large bald head for a reason. We're going to put things in it, right? So we got a guy thinking about that question. Why obey the divine law? Locke's idea is like this. So this guy's going to be thinking the Lockean thoughts. This is what Locke thinks we should be thinking. This is how we're going to figure out that we should obey the divine law. All right, why obey the divine law? Well, think of it like this. Take the idea that you have of God. Right? You can have that idea in your mind and you kind of think it through. Okay. And what is that idea? What is God like? Well, God's eternal, always existed. God is omnipotent, right? All powerful. God is omniscient, knows everything, completely wise. Yeah. And on the basis of traits like that, we know that God, our idea of God that we have, God's superior to us. He's way, way better than us. But he also made us. We are God's creation. Everything down here was made by God. So that's all contained in the idea that you have of God. That's what Locke thinks. Okay, so you have that idea in your mind. Okay, great. Keep it there. Now, get inside your mind, kind of alongside your idea of God, right? The idea of yourself. And, you think, what is that idea? Well, look, we're intelligent beings, we're rational, but we're not nearly as intelligent as God. We're very kind of limited. We're intelligent, but in a limited way, whereas God is intelligent without limit. He's as intelligent as you can get. We're pretty good, but we're frail and kind of weak. And on the basis of these kinds of things, like, yeah, we're kind of smart, but not that smart, right? We know that we're inferior to God. And moreover, Locke would say, when you think about yourself, you think about us, we know that we're created by God, right? So God's superior to us. We're inferior to God. God created us, and we were created by God. Okay, right? Those are the ideas that we have in mind. Locke's idea, why should you obey the divine law? If you have those two ideas in mind, you will just see that you ought to obey God. That if God gives you a command, you ought to follow it. Right? He says it's self-evident. That's what is. That's the blast of self-evidence. Of course I ought to obey God. God is superior to me. God made me. And so if God tells me to do something, of course I ought to do it. Of course I ought to obey God. One more time, just for good measure. Now that I'm looking at it, yeah, I don't know. It kind of looks like I'm making fun of Locke. I don't mean to be making fun of him. For what it's worth, people have found this argument to be less than compelling. Precisely, we'll do it one more time. Why not, right? Precisely because this point seems kind of inexplicable. Or it's like, it's just supposed to be self-evident? You're just supposed to, boom, see it? Well, I don't know. I don't see it. Some people have said. David Hume, who's a later philosopher, has a criticism, something along these lines. And the criticism he makes of it ends up becoming huge and influential. It's this is-ought gap. You may have heard of it before, right? The basic idea is you start from your idea of yourself. I am like this. I'm created by God. I'm inferior to God, blah, blah, blah. God is like that. God is our creator, and so on. And then we're supposed to conclude that I ought to obey God? How did ought get in there? Where did that ought come from? How can you derive an ought claim from an is claim? We're not going to worry about this problem, but you may have heard of it before. It's a very famous problem in ethics. In any event, that's Locke's argument. How do you do it according to Locke? Boom, it's just self-evident. That's how you do it. And so you should obey the divine law, not out of self-interest, Locke would say. You should obey the divine law because God is your creator and he gave you commands. Boom, end of story, right? That's Locke's view. You should obey the divine law because they're the commands of God, and God is superior to you and made you. And so obey his commands. We're going to see in the next video. So what this is already kind of bringing up now is, well, how is he, okay, that's interesting. How is that going to mesh with this Euthyphro dilemma? That's what we're going to do in the next video.